to what we call the 30 days, or the shloshim, as we call it in Hebrew, the 30 days of bereavement. You may see, Daniel, that many of us are dressed with black dresses. The 30 days of bereavement for all the victims of that horrible Simchat Torah day on the 7th of October. We'll have about 20 to 25 minutes lecture, and then we will proceed into an open discussion and questions and answers, and thus utilizing maximum of Professor Oldrich's presence and knowledge with us. Daniel, the floor is yours, and you're very welcome.
Thank you very much. First of all, it's an honor to be here. And of course, I'm sure all of us have in mind, the reason I'm talking today is a very small attempt to give a framework for thinking about what we could be doing as we seek to recover both the south of Israel and Israel more broadly. Hopefully you can see my first slide here. And of course, as always, I have put out my email address and other ways to contact me if you'd like to be in contact after this event. I think just to get right into it, as we're thinking about this idea of reconstruction and recovery, I would say that the most important aspect of what we need to think about is that people should be at the center of that process. And if we put people at the center of the process of reconstructing and rebuilding, then there are two aspects then that should impact everything that we do. One is that any decision that's made from now on in terms of rebuilding should recognize the role of social ties. And I'll talk about this more in details later, but one obvious example right now is the question of housing and relocation. As we've had tens of thousands of people had to relocate from the south, and we think about what will be with them. Will they, for example, live permanently in the north? Will they go back to the south? Will they have temporary housing? Anything that we do that touches on the issue of housing should begin with the recognition that we have a lot of research on the importance of group relocation, that is moving people not as individuals or individual families, but moving them in groups of at least 4 to 10 from wherever they are right now, maybe in shelters, maybe with friends or a hotel, to someplace more medium or long-term. So there we see, even in a very simple question, supposedly, which is where do we put people, this idea of social capital should drive how we make that decision with them. The second aspect of recognizing people are at the center would mean that everything that we do now revolves around their physical and mental well-being. And I'll give several examples of that as I talk. But that would be, for example, prioritizing mental health, what some have called right now psychosocial first aid, that is providing that assistance to them right now, even before we have, let's say, therapists, psychologists, or psychiatrists training people to provide them assistance, and also what I would call social infrastructure, ensuring right now that whether it's children or the elderly or normal middle-aged people, that we are building the places and spaces where they can connect to each other and to help restart their lives. For those of you who know my research, everything that I do since 2005 has focused on the importance of this idea of social capital, which are really the trust, neighbors, and networks that make our lives more enjoyable, but also provide that support network during tough times. And all social ties aren't the same. We divide them into 3 categories: bonding, bridging, and linking ties. Bonding social ties connect people who are quite similar. So close family, people from the same background, people who migrate from the same country, people with the same education level. That's bonding social capital. Another form of social ties are bridging social ties. Bridging social ties connect people who are different. This might be through a synagogue, it might be through a workplace, it might even be through a club or a restaurant. Where bonding and bridging ties are horizontal connections, linking social ties are vertical connections, the connections between individuals and decision makers. So for example, to what degree do you know or trust individuals making decisions about things like housing, about things like jobs or schools? Why do these matter during shocks and disasters? Well, the first and the most obvious thing that all of us who've been through a shock recognize is that once you go through a shock, you have to decide, do you go back to the location of that shock? Do you go back, for example, to the south of Israel, or in my case, much less devastating, to New Orleans, where I had Hurricane Katrina destroy our home? We call this decision exit or voice. Exit means after a major shock, you decide the financial, psychological, administrative costs are too large to return there. The memories are too tough. The area is not well defended. The area is vulnerable, and you choose exit and you move someplace else. In contrast, you might choose voice. Voice is when you recognize you have a connection to the area. It's your place. You feel like that's where your home is, and you'll do whatever it takes, however long it takes, to go back there. One of my favorite examples comes from Japan, from Fukushima meltdowns there, where I interviewed an 85-year-old survivor of those meltdowns. And she told me she doesn't care about radiation. She's willing to go back to that home because that's where her family is from and that's where she feels connected. So the very first choice a survivor makes after a major shock is exit or voice. Do I return to the area? And of course, your social connections, bonding, bridging, and linking ties, your trust in the community very much drive that very first choice. The second way that these social ties make a difference is that many of the challenges we face after a shock require collective action. That is to say, no one individual, no one family, no one institution can solve them. It requires us working together as a group. After a major disaster, of course, when we have many pressing issues, we have personal loss, we have job loss, we have a loss of normalcy, it's very challenging to get people to work in a coordinated fashion, to listen to advice. This collective action is made easier if they have trust, if they have connections, if they have a sense of community. And the third thing that we need after a major shock is what we call informal insurance or mutual aid. Oftentimes, gas stations, nurseries, places that provide food are all closed for days, if not weeks or even months after a major shock. Parts of Japan, for example, didn't have working gas stations for almost a year after the triple disasters. Who knows when supply chains will be reestablished in the south of Israel. My community in New Orleans had no childcare for almost half a year. So those providers are shut down. They're not going to reopen for weeks or months or years. So what is it that we can draw from? We call this informal insurance. Neighbors, friends, people who live nearby, we get that assistance from people who are within the area. That helps us then restart ourselves. Now, this has all been very abstract. I want to quickly go through some data to show you how important these ties are at various aspects of a shock. First of all, we know, and this is from Japan's 3/11 disasters, that oftentimes the rates of mortality, the rates of casualties are quite different across different communities. This is actually across 140 communities measuring the outcomes of the tsunami. And we see a large number of communities had actually relatively low casualty rates, but some communities lost up to 1/10 of their population. And my team and I spent about 2 years in Japan studying what factors impacted those mortality rates during and after that major shock. And the core predictor of survival here, or mortality, depending on your perspective, came from the weakness or strength of those bonding social capital ties. Communities in Japan that had weaker ties, that had fewer connections and less trust, the mortality there during shocks was much higher. In communities where there was cooperation, coordination, collaboration, where people had those interactions, the rates of survival were much higher. That's the initial stage, survival. In the recovery stage, we have data from a number of communities that have gone through a major shock. And here I've just put down 9 communities across the Tohoku area and the degree to which they're able to recover after 1 year, 2 years, and 3 years. And you see radical differences in recovery. Some communities able to bounce back from very low conditions on a scale of 1 to 100. Others, unfortunately, stuck for quite some time in intermediate or slow recovery times. The best predictor that we saw across these communities were their linking social ties, the degree to which they had trust and connections to decision makers, politicians, people able to provide aid. Because of course, after a major shock, after a major catastrophe, local communities lack the financial resources they need to do the rebuilding processes and so forth. The third area of recovery we can think about is mental health. And here are really 3 sets of patterns of the ways that communities after a major shock recover. The top row are what I would call the ideal resilient recoveries, where you go through a shock, your mental health is temporarily affected, but you can resume normalcy afterwards. The middle row there are the recovery and remitting processes, where you have a drop with the shock, and then you maybe have some inability to focus. It's hard to stay on one task. And we can talk about how to measure this in a second. The bottom row, unfortunately, are the worst. Examples of PTSD and dysfunction, where after a major shock, it's very challenging to stay focused, maybe hard to keep a job or keep a relationship because those intrusive thoughts keep repeating. We have issues of PTSD and so forth. And what we did was we studied this after a triple disaster. We studied after an earthquake, nuclear meltdowns, and major evacuation. We had around 4,000 people that we talked to over time. We imagined that this mental health would be a function of income and physical health, that individuals who are wealthier, for example, could get more assistance from psychologists or therapists. Individuals who are wealthier could find a new community to move to more easily. And we also envisioned that individuals who had a broader degree of physical health would be able to bounce back. Those are not accurate, by the way. We had no support for those. In fact, what we found, the only predictive way to keep mental health positive after a major shock was social capital, having individuals in the network who you can connect with, help people to connect. I want to transition now and say, if social ties are a critical element of what we do, then what can we do to build them? I want to really quickly go through 6 broader ideas and then focusing on one. Hopefully you recognize the man in the red sweater. Of course, that's Fred Rogers, who every day of my childhood asked me, Daniel, to be a good neighbor. He didn't say Daniel, but he did say be a good neighbor. And we've tried around the world, in Australia and San Francisco and elsewhere, to build programs that interact neighbor to neighbor so that people have this trust with people who live nearby. From the neighbor, we see the neighborhood. It's an image from Indiana, a block party there, where again, you block off the streets from cars, you have interaction. And the idea was, again, to have an active process where the community builds connections to each other. There's a program in San Francisco that will give you $4,000 every year to build these connections to neighbors. Neighborhood to city. I'll talk about this in a few minutes, but the idea of social infrastructure more broadly. What's the density of synagogues, parks, libraries, places to meet, community centers? I'll talk about that in a second. The bottom left-hand corner is civic engagement. To what degree do politicians and decision makers in communities at the regional and national levels make an attempt to include people in zoning, planning, restoration committees? Then, of course, we have the importance of faith-based communities, synagogues and mosques, and so forth. And finally, things like community currency programs, where we actively build social ties by encouraging people through incentives, for example, like providing $5 Toronto for volunteering for an hour in Toronto. I want to zoom in now on those ideas of social infrastructure for my remaining time, and just briefly talk about why I think this should be a critical focus as Israel considers what to do next. I've been obsessed for a while with social capital. That obsession has now changed into obsession with where those social ties come from. And I would say that a lot of the research that we're doing is showing us that there are 4 main categories of spaces and places in our society where we can reknit, we can retie the social fabric. Those are what we call community spaces, places of worship, social businesses, and parks. And these images in front of you now categorize, or at least image, those 4 types of things. Again, community spaces, places of worship, social businesses, and parks. Of course, community spaces would be a city hall, an open space, a plaza. A place of worship would be a synagogue or a mosque. A social business would be a park or a restaurant, a video game parlor, a karaoke bar, a cafe. And a park would be any green space that we have. It might be a linear reserve, like I found it when I was walking in Adelaide in the mornings. It might be a broader space. Why do these kind of spaces matter? Our research shows us that these are active sites where we build bridging ties. That means at parks, community centers, places of worship, and social businesses, what we see is people building connections to people they did not know as well. These are the weaker ties, the thin ties, ties of people that you had maybe only seen their face before once or twice. Maybe you had seen them at a faculty meeting, or maybe you had run across them at some local restaurant. These are, for example, when you go to the park with a child or a dog and you get in a conversation with a fellow parent, or you go to a restaurant and you hear someone nearby talking about a friend of yours and you butt into the conversation and say hello. These places, as you see on this slide, have a positive and measurable connection in building bridging ties. What they don't do is build bonding or linking ties. That is to say, they don't increase familial connection. They don't connect, for example, my mom and I don't go to a park to build connections, and they don't build linking ties either. That is to say, they're not ones that build with the mayor. But what they do is give us a broader, what we call generalized trust. And again, people that we don't know as well. Why does this matter? It matters because, as you'll see from this image, we can decide in the rebuilding process to actively include sites of social infrastructure like the one that you're looking at right now. This is from our Ibasho Cafe in Japan, in Masakicho. This was a blank space. It was literally an empty spot in the community. We worked with them to build a site where the elderly, who typically have the weakest and fewest links in our societies, could get together. And everyone there with the yellow vest in this image is our group leader. They have to be 65 or over. And those individuals we showed in our research were able to build not only more friends, but deeper connections, more trust, and a sense of belonging. So we're able to actively build this from nothing, from where there were no connections at all. And then we measured this as well. What impact did these kind of sites have on things like mortality during shocks? The first was communities with more libraries, parks, and spaces of worship, controlling for all other factors. The overall mortality rates were lower. Those social ties being connected and created in these spots saved lives during a major shock. And then we also measured what happens afterwards as communities decide, how do you spend reconstruction dollars? What gets you the best recovery, both in terms of economics and population? So one is we used here in North America, we used around 20 different counties. In Louisiana, they call them parishes because the Catholic Church is still powerful there. And we measured what happened in those communities as local communities spent the money on different items. We measured 4 different types of projects that you could spend after a major shock. What we're calling a hard infrastructure project. Think about security or a wall. Think about things like bridges or ports or dams, and whether or not it was top down or local. So the yellow vision, the yellow colored there you see, those are from state-sponsored top-down projects. The top level blue are the hard projects, and the middle 2 are soft projects, that is to say social infrastructure at the local level. Notice in terms of both income and migration, the best outcomes for the community came when investments were made in social infrastructure. We had a higher income for people coming back to the community and more individuals coming back to the community when those investments were made in social infrastructure. In contrast, when authorities decided to build top-down plans, plans that came from the outside, and plans focusing on things like physical infrastructure, overall economic recovery was worse, and overall migration patterns were slower or fewer. And by the way, this data was the same across North American and Japanese communities, where we had investments that were primarily top-down and based on physical infrastructure, recoveries of population and income were lower. Just wrapping up now. So just thinking more broadly, what is it that we should be considering as we think about the recovery process? The first is recognizing after a major shock, 2 issues are at the forefront of people's minds. The survivors want a place to stay, housing, and they want to make sure that their social ties are present. And I can show you in different papers from different labs how important those 2 aspects are, housing and social ties. And even in that housing process, as I mentioned, we've measured the consequences of moving individuals to group relocation, moving them as families, as neighborhoods, moving them individually. When we keep social ties intact during the movement process, social ties stay together and are intact. When we move individual families in that process, we break them apart and we lose social capital and we lose those ties. Okay, so this is my last slide. I think that was 20 minutes or fewer, so I've managed to meet my time requirement this morning. When we think about recovery after disaster, many of us fall back on the easy and obvious to measure aspects of the recovery process, which is physical infrastructure. Things like bridges, parks, roads, security sites, and walls. Those are the obvious things. But the reality, though, is that what builds our connections and what makes us more resilient are the often underappreciated sites, libraries, synagogues, parks, bars, restaurants. It's precisely in those sites we often overlook that we have the possibility of connection right through bridging social ties, building those connections. These are unfortunately often the places that get spent money on last. And certainly here in North America and around the world, they're the places that we often cut budgets for first. So I'll stop talking now and happy to talk the conversation. Oh, sorry, you're muted. Reuven, you're muted.
All right, I'll repeat what I said. First of all, thank you very much. Those 25 minutes were very valuable. We'll continue, but so far it's already a great contribution. I mentioned the fact that we are recording this lecture, and I will also say that you've been kind enough to send us the presentation ahead early enough, so we will distribute it to everyone. Among the people who are listening or watching or on the screen, there are also several people who are like Shira Goldberg. I see she's already here. They are from a special agency that was established by the government, and it's called agency Tkuma or recovery, which is very relevant to what you're talking. I'm sure it will be very valuable to them. We have many questions. I'll have some, but before that, I will ask our CEO, Professor Maron, if you have any question to address to Daniel. If not, I have several.
Not so much a question, a comment that I think that the lecture stresses the importance of driving recovery of infrastructure and resilience in general by the social, from the social direction, and this is something that is not trivial, not at all. I mean, we do tend to find ourselves to recover the infrastructure, which is the hard infrastructure, not the soft one. And I'm now appreciating more. So thank you for this lecture.
Welcome.
I see among our guests also Micha Drovi from the Kibbutz Mouchad. So there are people not only from the. This is for you, Daniel. The core group here is what we call the Resilience Forum at the Samuel Naaman Institute, but there are several guests that have joined us, and I'm very pleased to have them here. Let me address you with two questions of mine, and all the others you are very welcome to follow. Number one, most of what you talked about refer to, or I assume they refer to, natural-made disasters, earthquakes, hurricanes, and so on. We are now talking about a man-made disaster, and you know the story about the 7th of October. How much of your conclusions and data you see relevant to a man-made disaster as opposed to natural-made disaster?
Do you want to answer that one, or should I wait to the second question and take both? I'm happy to answer that one.
The second one is, you called the two options at the very beginning, you called one exit and the other one you called voice. I assume you meant by voice, you were referring to those people who stay at the location and raise their voice for help and for survival, and so on. Many of the people who stayed or even were evacuated remained voiceless in our case. So voice is not always there. Many times they are really voiceless, and you need somebody else's voice or service or hands to help them. These are the two questions.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for those questions. So it's funny, our lab actually works across a range of what we call natural hazards and man-made disasters. So in fact, some of the data that you saw today came from a very much a man-made disaster, which was Fukushima. And I've also had various students working on, and myself working on things like the Syrian civil war. We have data from the white helmets, for example, that we were getting. We have worked with refugees into Turkey. We also have work from a number of African-based man-made disasters. So I would argue that these social ties and social infrastructure are just as important in a natural hazard, like a flood, like a fire, as they are in a man-made disaster, like the attacks of the 7th of October, or like other terror attacks that we've seen. So we find consistently that social ties and social infrastructure are critical elements, regardless of the type of shock that happened, and regardless of the source. As for exit and voice, it's a great question. That title, actually, I've borrowed from an economist in the 1960s named Albert Hirschman, who wrote a book called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. And the way we use it in our lab is exit means, as you've said, exit means you decide that the costs of staying or returning to a vulnerable community are too high. And voice means that you work together to activate those ties in your community and try to make a difference there. It doesn't necessarily matter, for example, if politically you have a voice. A voice in this sense means more a voice with the community itself. So you're activating ties, telling people this matters to them, you're giving information. We can talk more about that if you like. There's a whole field of work that we've done, what we call signal and noise. After a shock, the government has a lot of things it wants to say, right? It wants to tell people that you can come back or you shouldn't come back. It wants to tell people this is safe or this is not safe. And we call that often noise. Noise meaning it's often meaningless to people. How do you translate from noise into signal? Well, it depends on who's providing that information. And what we found is that in these trusted networks that use voice, those messages become clearer and acted upon. So you can imagine an evacuation order, for example, in Hawaii during the Lahaina fires, right, would have been much more effective from a neighbor, right, than just a siren going off when it's unclear what the siren refers to. And so too during other shocks that we've seen, when information is coming from a trusted source, it becomes information as opposed to noise. So in any case, exit and voice here doesn't necessarily mean they have to have a political movement or march afterwards. It really means more the voice of things being heard locally by their activism in the community.
Got it. Very good. Thank you. I invite people to please, if you want to join us with questions, please raise a hand, either an application hand or your own hand. I see Deborah Shmueli first. Please also use a very short, very brief introduction about who you are when you ask the questions. Deborah, b'vakasha.
Actually, I didn't raise my hand. It was Eli Salzberger who raised his hand, but I'm Deborah Shmueli, and Daniel, it's wonderful to see you again. And your work is really, I think, incredibly relevant to what we're doing, and in all the many different directions that we're going. I think that the social capital is not getting the focus that's needed. It is among all the very voluntary unifying things that come, but I think that in terms of policy, it's probably critical.
Thank you, Deborah. Lee, so it was your hand.
Yes. Thank you very much, Daniel. I also thought about Hirschman, and I thought that loyalty should be your second option and not voice, because it's loyalty to the community. But anyway, two questions. One, with regard to social bonding, I wonder, how do you really measure social bonding? And if you have a recipe for us for research, this would be great. But the main question is the special circumstances that our disaster is characterized by is a total lack of faith in the government. This is not the case of Japan. I'm not sure if it's the case of New Orleans. And I wonder, how do your recommendations and analysis adapt themselves to a situation in which there is total lack in the central government, and there is much more trust in local communities, local government, and really social fabric? I don't know if you know, but the main responded in the first months we are now marking was not government agencies, but mainly civil society, organization of civil society. So I wonder how your conclusions transform in such circumstances. Thanks.
Yeah, these are great questions, Eli. Thank you. So yes, and we do have measures for bonding. Actually, we have measures for bonding, bridging, and linking. And we have a battery. We have actually around 15 pages of questions that we draw from in building both our qualitative and quantitative surveys. And I'm very happy to mail them to whoever on the call would be interested. We've been using them around the world. We've used them in Japan and Puerto Rico. We've used them in India and Australia. And for bonding, we often ask questions like this. To what degree are most of your friends look and sound like you? Right. So, for example, think about Olim from America who've moved to Israel. Right. Oftentimes they live to an Anglo community, whether it's Beit Shemesh, for example. So for them, the bonding ties there would be people whose first language is still English and not yet Hebrew, even if their children's first language might be Hebrew. And for those individuals, for example, their networks are still very much activated in the diaspora, as opposed to someone who might have been born, a Sabra, someone who's born from Israel, right? And in their lives, their network is built around Hebrew language speakers and people from around the world. So yes, we have a number of measures we use for bonding, bridging, and linking, and I'm happy to send them to you. The question about the faith in government actually is quite sad. It's quite sad, of course, because I have been following Israeli politics. I have a number of friends who have made Aliyah, and I go to Israel myself a lot. And of course, I've been following the news. I wish I could say that the lack of faith in Japan, in the government, is only in Israel. But in fact, in every disaster that I've studied, whether in North America, in Australia, in Japan, or elsewhere, in fact, that lack of faith has come with the disaster. And I can just really quickly talk about those. Certainly in Japan's case, we would expect that the trust in Japan is high. In fact, after the Fukushima aspect of the disaster, Japan dropped from the top 3 countries in terms of trust in government to the bottom 40th country in terms of trust in government. So that Fukushima disaster revealed a huge gap between people. The government of Japan initially denied there was a meltdown. They called it a core crisis. The information they provided was inaccurate and didn't help people evacuate. They didn't assist people leaving areas. Like in Futaba, for example, they didn't provide the potassium iodine pills you could use after a nuclear disaster to help reduce the likelihood of thyroid cancer. So all those problems meant that Japanese people, even now, a decade later, still have lower trust in Japan than they had a decade ago, and then many other countries still have. And absolutely the same thing happened in New Orleans. I'm sure you all know the story. New Orleans was very much unprepared for Hurricane Katrina when it arrived. There was no food, shelter, water on the ground. There was no major place to meet. The place they chose eventually was a sports stadium, which in fact the roof ripped open. There was chaos inside. So in most of these major disasters around the world, the shock itself is accompanied with a massive drop in trust. Now, Israel may have had already a lack of trust. That's certainly possible. So that might be a little bit more intense, but certainly at the end of the day, I have yet to find a major disaster where a drop in trust did not come with that process. Now that is, if you remember my discussion about bonding, bridging, and linking ties, that means that right now, for the average resident, certainly for the average survivor in the South, information coming from the government is going to be on that spectrum from signal to noise. It's going to be noise. Why is it going to be noise? Because the vast majority of them are thinking, well, the government didn't assist. It wasn't there on the ground. It didn't give us fair warning. It didn't take the cues from security personnel and intelligence. It wasn't there initially, like civil society organizations have been. So that's a problem for the government. It's a problem because, as you know, if you have a relationship with someone, trust is built through a series of transactions over time. a major slip in trust, a major loss in trust. Cannot be just made up by an apology, cannot be made up through a, saying in Latin, a mea culpa, public admission. It takes time. Japan, which did have even higher trust, is still trying to build back trust with the survivors in Fukushima. And as Ellie mentioned, it had higher trust initially. So this is a problem. And again, I would say part of the policy process now should be for individuals in the agencies working with survivors to think through, how do we establish trust? I can give you one example that comes to mind from New Zealand, actually. After the earthquake, New Zealand's community there lost several hundred lives in the earthquake in 2010, completely surprising many people that the quality of buildings was low. They had to evacuate the downtown. What the government did in response was it began placing its civil servants not in an office by themselves where they would make pronouncements, right? Everything is fine, or come get food. They began placing their members in civil society. So every week, a third of the staff leaves the offices of the civil servant agency, of the government agency, and goes to embed in schools, in local churches and synagogues, in after-school events. In other words, rather than coming to the people coming to them, they go to the people and they embed there. What does that do? It shows a humility, right? There's anivut, I believe is the phrase, right? It shows that they're willing to say, we don't necessarily have everything, all the information that we need in our offices, right? Where we're safe and secure and insulated from your anger and your feelings of frustration. Two, it gives people actually a chance to speak to someone directly. Oftentimes, if you're a survivor of a shock, and I speak as someone who survived a minor shock, which is Hurricane Katrina, getting someone to talk to you from the government, right, when there are thousands of other survivors, is really hard. Back when I left Hurricane Katrina, we had to use a fax machine to try to communicate our needs. So, fax machines take about 2 or 3 minutes to get one piece of paper through. You've got no idea what's going on. There's no phone call back. And that level of frustration that I felt now more than 2 decades ago is much stronger, of course, now, right? When you have social media, when you have amplification of voices, and it's really hard to know, is the government actually listening? So again, how do we rebuild the trust that maybe we lost a little bit or a lot in Israel? I would say the first part is this anivut, where again, people-centered means rather than the experts being on a Zoom call like we are right now, or being in an office where we're safe and insulated, we go out into the community where people are, go to the hotels where survivors are staying, go to the temporary shelters where they're staying, and spend that time there with them, right? To show them both that I'm listening and also to give them someone to actually put a face to a name.
Anava, not anivut.
Anava, thank you. Yeah, so I would be one of those Anglos not speaking very good Hebrew if I were there.
Also during the Corona, we looked up to New Zealand's, some of their approaches, something to learn from. Thank you. I have Micha Drori here, and next will be Professor Maron, and you're invited to raise your hands.
Hi, my name is Micha Drori. I'm the legal advisor of the Kibbutz movement, and I got my PhD from the Technion. I have many questions, but I'll ask only 2. First, we feel a lot of tension, or maybe there's a gap between the need and desire to find physical solutions, but we feel that the mental situation of people is moving a lot slower. For example, all our communities were evacuated to hotels, and they feel that a hotel is not a good place to stay for long, and they want to move out of the hotel. But people ask them, where do you want to move to? And they really are not sure. So there's like a tension that the system wants them maybe to get a decision, where do they want to move, but they don't feel that they know yet what they really want. How do you deal with that? Another issue is that the kibbutzim are very unique. There's a unique situation here that the kibbutzim are actually a legal structure. They're organized. They have institutions. They have leaders, elected leaders. They have management. And they're used to work through that system in a formal way. And we feel that we and also all the other entities that deal with them should respect that and benefit from the existence of such leadership. Do you think that's important, or should we try and contact each person personally?
Oh, these are great questions. So first of all, thank you, Dr. Drolli. So I'll start with this question of, in a sense, the messiness, right, of the decision-making right now, which is obviously for the government and for people asking questions, it'd be easy to hear if everyone who survives says, we're going to move back right now, or we're going to move someplace else right now. And I can tell you from now working with a number of disasters that it's almost never the case. Just to give you a few examples, in Japan, it took 5 years of living in temporary shelters before some communities had a solid plan. Do they evacuate to higher ground and move permanently there? Do they move the ground? Do they put up a wall instead? Do they put up a wall and move back? So it took a number of years of very messy discussion. So the pressure is on often from the government and from survivors. Somehow we feel this need, we have to move fast. And I think that's a challenge in every post-disaster situation. If you've ever read Rob Olshansky's work, he calls it compressed time. After a disaster, everything is kind of mashed together. Everything feels like it's out of sorts. And we feel this real urgency, right, to get things moving. I would say that the successful recoveries step back from that urgency and say, if it takes a year, if it takes a decade, that's how much time we will deal with this. So for example, if people are saying we're unhappy in hotels, but we don't know if we're going to move back to the south or move to my aunt in Haifa or whatever, right? We should give them that space to make that decision. And I would say with your second question, collectively. And so here's the hard part. Making decisions collectively is slow, messy, and often inconclusive. So for example, can you do a ballot? Can you ask each person to vote on what they want to do? Can you have a conversation with each person? This is your second question about leadership. I think you cannot go wrong having both government and experts. That is to say, some kind of, I think you mentioned the Takuma, the Agency of Recovery, speaking to every single survivor who can speak from age 5 to age 95, the more voices that we can get in, asking them very straightforward questions. So first this is just me speaking here, I would start with the obvious question, which is, how are you? And we have a lot of very easy to use measures like the Kessler 6, the K6, which are 6 questions that help evaluate people's mental status. They're not complicated. They don't require you to have a PhD in psychology. They're like, over the past month, how hard has it been to get to sleep? Or how hard has it been to have a purpose in the day? Right? So very straightforward questions. And again, I can send these questions if people are interested. You also can find them in any normal pilot. But the K6 questionnaire gives you a very quick insight into mental health. And if the K6 scores are high, higher is worse with K6, then rather than focusing on, for example, decision-making and democracy, my first focus would be on mental health and psychosocial care. It doesn't have to be a formal psychologist or a therapist. I know the ITC, the Israel Trauma Coalition, has been using a variety of verbal and nonverbal ways to interact with people. So that means, for example, bringing a therapy dog to children at a school. It means, getting parents into a pool to float on their backs and take a few deep breaths. It means taking a walk together someplace nearby, right? So there are things that we can be doing now that are not about the recovery process of the physical stuff, but really the mental health. So that's the first stage, asking those questions, what's going on. Then in those same conversations that we're having with everyone that maybe 140,000 conversations that we're having, we ask this question of, what do you want to do, right? Not what does the kibbutz want to do, not what does the legal authority want to do, but what does each individual person want to do? Because it's very possible I could be the member of a community and the community may want to rebuild or not, and I may have a completely different opinion. Again, maybe my vision is to move to Kashrim, right? Up in the north, and that's where I'm going to spend the rest of my life now because I have a cousin there. Who knows? But until we have that conversation, no one's heard my voice. So to go back and forth between your two questions, the tension that you're feeling, that sense of slowing down because of the mental health issue, I think that's important to slow down, to deal with the mental health, to get those questions asked, to spend time with each individual person. Hotels are not the ideal place, right? You can't, in a hotel, there's not little space for kids to run around. Hotels are often far from school locations. Hotels themselves have very little social infrastructure. For example, in terms of like parks nearby, they have one pool, but everyone can't be there at the same time, right? So we do want to think about, how do we have what might be intermediate spaces for evacuees right, in the meantime, as they decide what to do, again, to return to their homes in the South or to make new communities. And that may take not weeks or months, it might take years. I can just think back, by the way, if you studied, as some of my colleagues have, the consequences of the Gaza withdrawal last time, when we moved people out, right, into a tent city, right? And then from tent cities to karavanim, and I think that's the correct term, and then from there to permanent housing, right? That process had consequences, right? That did not last weeks or months, but years. So again, thinking through this, not as a short-term problem that has to be solved in this term of office for whatever politician, however that long that's going to be, but rather has to be solved according to the problem. And then, yes, there might be a formal legal structure for the kibbutz or the kibbutzim, but the question should be for each individual. Every survivor, you want to have a phone number and an email address for every survivor. And again, my suggestion would be talking face-to-face with them. The best recoveries that I've seen have been ones that draw on those conversations, hundreds, if not thousands of conversations, to build a vision for what people want to do.
Thank you. Shimon?
Yes, thank you. I want to touch an aching point here, and the discussion so far focuses on a local disaster and the local remediation or reconstruction, physical or social. And in our case, I'm afraid there are some non-local, devastating non-local impacts to the disaster. And I'm referring to the cohesiveness of the Israeli society at large, and more concretely, the very delicate infrastructure of relation between Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews within Israel, throughout Israel. Will you comment on that, please? If you have something to say, I'm not sure. Whatever. I
mean, first of all, I would begin by saying I know nothing about Israeli society enough to comment broadly, but I would tell you what I can see just from other shocks and other societies. The cohesiveness of the society as a whole is somewhat important. It is somewhat important. I would say that's not the deciding factor in how the recovery is going to go. For that question to be answered, it's much more about the evacuees and their networks. To what degree are they able to find generalized trust? To what degree are they able to build those bridging ties to people different than them, for example? To what degree are they able to focus and survive in daily life? Certainly, Israel has had, before this horrible massacre, a number of political challenges that have divided the country. From what I've seen, amazingly enough, civil society has been relatively unified in its response to the shock. And I know someone already mentioned earlier, right, it has not been necessarily the government agencies on the front lines doing a lot of the work, but has been civil society organizations, we call them CSOs or NGOs, organizing food deliveries and psychosocial care. And again, we mentioned the ITC and other communities like that. So, I'm not as worried, is Israeli society as a whole cohesive? Because again, for this kind of shock recovery, that is a piece of it. But for me, I'd be much more concerned about what are we seeing in the communities themselves most directly affected. The spillover effects, the consequences, I would say, are secondary impact.
Thank you. Any more questions from the people on the Zoom line? I'll address you with another question I have.
Wait, sorry. I think Ishi Talmon has his hand up.
Ishi Baksha.
Oh, but you're muted. Oh, Ishi Lo Shomea. I can't.
Ishi, be mute.
Sorry, yes. I was muted. Thank you again for this wonderful lecture. We are here in a unique situation. There was, of course, that horrible massacre on the 7th of October, but we are still in a war. So this is an ongoing situation when communities are under fire. There's a lot of uncertainty whether a second front will open or a third front, and this definitely complicates things. So the question is, this may be similar to what you have studied in Syria in some ways, although the situation is very different. But this is a complicating factor, I would think. And this uncertainty, how long will this take? When can we actually start building the society, building the infrastructure? This is a very complicating factor, I would think.
I completely agree.
To follow on, you're talking about the evacuees and those who were affected directly. But I think that the whole of the Israeli society, every person is in a trauma. So it's not only, thinking about, of course, we have to think first about those who were affected directly and the hostages and the families, but it's much broader than, and I think this might be a point of difference from natural disasters and other disasters to what is going on in Israel at the moment. And as you say, it's an ongoing thing, and people have, people are afraid that things will develop further in a very, very bad direction. So, we're going to open the academic year in a few weeks. We are not even, we don't know how we going to address the students, a mixed group of Arab and Jewish students. So the magnitude of trauma is basically a national magnitude, and it goes to really every person. I think these are specific features of the situation that we are at the moment.
Yeah, and I think, thank you, Ishi and Eli, for those points. Several ideas. One is, strangely enough, the worst disasters generate one small positive externality, one small positive benefit, which is that in all of our measurements after things like 9/11, for example, or attacks elsewhere around the world, there is a short-lived, usually about a year, of cohesiveness that's created by the event itself. This sense of trauma, yes, but also a sense of esprit de corps and solidarity. And there is this strange, again, outcome, a very small positive outcome from a horrible event like this, which is that you see people pulling together. Some of my colleagues have called this the rally around the flag effect. The French for it would be esprit de corps. So even though obviously every people across Israel and across the diaspora right now are in shock and definitely under trauma, I think you also have the strange fact is people are able to pull together against a united enemy. So yes, the uncertainty and the unclarity are definitely part of it. And I think the only thing that the government and agencies should be talking about would be honesty here, and being open and honest and saying, we're all uncertain. We all don't know what's going on. I think the worst thing that could happen right now would be for a government agency to make a claim. We have a clear vision for what's going to happen next. We are set to go this direction. I think that is ridiculous and would be damaging. And again, we have data from a lot of disasters around the world, both what I would call natural hazards and man-made. When people on the ground think that they're not getting accurate information or think they're being lied to, that gap opens up even further. So for me, at least, the thing that should be happening now, which should be an honest conversation, right? Israel is under attack still, as you said, right? Whether it's going to be in Gaza or Lebanon or elsewhere. And we don't know what's going to happen in a week or a month. The top priority, again, in my perspective, should be the people, a people-centered recovery. And if that means that security is the top of the priority, great. That will happen. If in contrast, it's not security, but something else, again, a sense of cohesiveness or a sense of trust, and that's what should be the top. But that should come from the people. These should not be generated by some small committee of experts or generated by some government agency. The vision for what people, survivors and elsewhere in Israel are going to do should be a people-centered one, meaning we should be asking people what they want. So I think you're right. There's a national trauma. There's lack of clarity. The only way forward here is honesty about that and an attempt to make it clear to people we know that is happening and we're here to listen and be engaged.
Thank you. I see Ron and I see Shai. Professor Ron Canet, please.
I came a bit late to your talk, so I think the issue that Ishi refers to is that we are in a dynamic situation. In a funny way, this has similarity to the Corona situation. Initially, things were happening, nobody understood the extent of it, how to respond. Okay, what do we do? And then things started clearing up. There was fake news involved. And then vaccination came in. So how to deal with a dynamic situation is posing maybe challenges that are beyond the research questions that you can ask, 10 years after a disaster. There is another dimension here. So that's just a reflection. My question is on something that I've been looking into, which are patterns, organizational patterns. By a pattern, I consider, for example, your New Zealand example. They move to schools. Okay, that can be considered a generic solution that can be adopted. Are there, from the studies and from your lab, patterns? Is there a list of patterns? Is there a source of information for patterns that can be, we don't want to relearn everything.
That are measurable.
Yes. So first of all, thank you for that point. And I agree also, by the way, the dynamic you mentioned, we didn't talk much about fake news and disinformation, but obviously that's also part of many of these disasters and shocks. There's a variety of actors, right, looking to exploit a shock like this, using fake information, right, to drive and exploit those existing cleavages in society. Yes, and I'm happy to send, and I've written a bunch of articles about the patterns and of ways that, again, both society, civil society, and government agencies can respond. The New Zealand example is one of those ways, and I talked a little bit before. Again, building cohesion at the neighbor-to-neighbor level, at the neighborhood level, or design, civic engagement, for example, active things like community currencies, for example. Yes, so I'm happy to send that to whoever would be interested. There are definitely things that we've learned across them.
Thank you. Shai Ben Yosef.
I have two questions back to the internal communities which are affected by the situation. First one is about leadership. In this time, after any kind of trauma, there is emerge of new leadership, people which we didn't consider them as the leaders. They showed up and they start to lead, and there is a tension between them and among them and the formal and informal old leadership, even if the old leadership don't function well in the situation. So there is a tension. How to manage the tension between the new and emergent, maybe most of the time, women's leadership in the community and the old formal and non-formal leadership in the community. And the second question, which may refer to the first one, is about there are a lot of conflicts and tension which was there in the community before the trauma, and they now showed up in a large extent, and we see them on the surface. So how can we deal with these tensions and still maintain the high level of social social ties?
Again, great questions. So the leadership question is a great one. I agree. Oftentimes, moments like this, shocks and disasters, will bring up and now a new level, a new generation of informal leadership. And again, I think part of responding to the shock is being flexible in what we assume. Do we only allow the existing formal structures to be those representatives, or are we going to make space, for example, a new leader, a new rising person, whether it's a new CSO or a women's group or a local school teacher, whoever it's going to be, with ideas? Again, I think the best recoveries are ones that are flexible and open and allow in a variety of inputs, not just the formal, who is the representative of the kibbutz, or who's the representative of this group or the political party, or there are all kinds of ways we could cut society, right? Political parties, formal institutional cleavages, and so forth. And I think part of this is you're seeing people who didn't before, and talking about going back to the issue of voice, have a voice or think they had a voice. We're seeing now that those people want to have a voice. And by the way, this is a side note, many times after shocks, political activism goes up. So a lot of the measurements that we have, for example, of things like voting, getting involved in the leader, writing letters, getting civic engagement, those rise after a disaster because people recognize now there were things going on they didn't understand, that they were helpful or not helpful, and now they see, as you just said, the conflicts and tensions beforehand come to the front. And again, I think the only way to deal with that is openly and honestly, and not try to put it under the rug or tell everyone, oh, you have to get along right now. I think, this is part of the process of recovery, is the network itself, figuring out what are the boundaries of the network, who's in and who's out, how do we deal with that ourselves? We have to give space to those survivors. If they're still mad that 5 years ago someone made the decision to, I don't know, plant this crop versus this crop, or allow in someone new to the kibbutz they didn't like, part of this process requires openness and flexibility and listening. There may not be a solution. There might not be a way to get rid of that tension. That might be a permanent fixture now in the political landscape or in the social landscape. I think, again, the worst thing to do would be to say, oh, we're in a rush. We don't have time for that right now. Keep that under the control as we focus on something else. That is the something else. Because again, a people-centered recovery means people's approaches, people's needs and feelings, that takes priority, even if we think, oh, no, my only job is to build as much housing as quickly as possible, or to build a new security fence or whatever it is. That may not be that the people on the ground really care about right now. Maybe they want to have that fight about, who's chamim or better, or they really want to, to figure out, which nusach in the synagogue should be done. So that process has to be let go in whatever time it takes. And again, we talked about this idea of compressed time. It may take more time to get those things worked out, and that's part of the recovery process.
Thank you. And I just want to mention for you, Daniel, the person you just answered this question, Shai Ben Yosef, is a member of our forum of the resilience, usually a civilian, and you saw him now in uniforms as a reserve officer in our home security.
In the home front command.
Correct. Deborah, please.
So two separate thoughts. One goes back to Shimon's comment and Ellie's comment, about it being a national trauma as well. And although and you saying that some of this is secondary, and not definitely evacuees, and that's forefront, but I'm not sure it's secondary, because I think that if you're talking about, for instance, you may have one of your windows of opportunity to develop more trust and cohesiveness. Right now, there's a lot of fear and between Israeli and Jewish Israelis, Arab and Jewish Israelis,
entities.
Identities. Thanks, Rachel. Identities. And I think that it's kind of a critical part of our recovery process as a nation, not to put it aside as secondary, but actually to bring it to the forefront and try to find ways of working together now. And you see some of it. So that was one, and it certainly deals with trust and cohesiveness. The other thing, I have a question about New Zealand and about compressed time. And so if you look at the Christchurch recovery, even now, there are many projects that have not come to fruition.
That's right.
So on the one hand, they, certainly took the time for the Build Back Better, et cetera. But have you done any evaluations that would, the question of so many years after, you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, again, these are both great points. So that New Zealand is absolutely true. By taking time, it has meant that not every building has been demolished or rebuilt, right? The downtown, the red zone certainly is so much a red zone, and it may never be back to where it was. I think the flip side of that is, though, the recovery is one driven by people. In the sense that, we outsiders may have a vision that, okay, well, getting those buildings back was a core thing, or getting the downtown back was a core thing. But that wasn't how their recovery turned out. And I think this is part of our managing expectations process, that it could be precisely because it's a people-centered recovery, bottom up, we're looking for their feelings, their thoughts, their connections to drive what's happening, it may be that we don't rebuild every building, we don't rebuild every part of the community. And certainly, by the way, speaking of things that come to a forefront, I mentioned both New Orleans and Japan data that we have on recovery processes. In many times, a recovery does not mean that you're back to where you were. And this is, again, often we have to shake this mentality that we think, well, recovery of New Orleans, a recovery of Japan, a recovery of the south of Israel will mean it is now as it was before. That's very unlikely. It is very unlikely for all kinds of reasons, beyond just casualty levels or anything else. It's unlikely because oftentimes the new city, and it is a new city that's rebuilt, is a different demographic. And certainly that's been the case in North America after major shocks. It's been the case in Australia as well. And it's also been the case in Japan. Those moments, those critical trauma moments, when we do have things thrown off, often if there's a broader trend, for example, if people have been moving away from the periphery toward major cities, that's accelerated by these kind of moments. So meaning that if your town is already a small town losing population or not growing, it's very likely, and again, this is just me speaking here, predicting, it's very likely you're not going to see a massive recovery of that small town. Many times you'll see survivors going to bigger towns nearby for all kinds of reasons. Networks are there, it's easier access, vulnerability is lower, whatever. So that's one pattern. It's likely to see that we're not going to simply rebuild as was because the people are not going to be there to rebuild. Certainly talking about a man-made disaster, in Fukushima's case, the government of Japan has put in $2 billion to rebuild communities. In some cases, 1 in 50 people have come back, 1 in 50, right? So again, the government hoped that by putting the money in, everyone would show up again. That has not been the case. So I think this is absolutely the reality of most disasters. We cannot expect that just because we're putting in time or our plan, that means that that town, that community, that kibbutz will rebuild as was. Again, we have to see what people there on the ground want to do with that. We cannot expect that it means it's going to rebuild as it was.
Thank you. Any more questions from our audience? Michal, please.
Just to tie on for this last point, how do you evaluate success of recovery?
Fantastic. So unfortunately, oftentimes government agencies do it by population recovery, right? How many people come back to the community that left? And I think that's not a great recovery. We evaluate recovery by asking people who do come back, how much are you part of this process? How much do you have satisfaction with this process? How much do you see this as a success? So we don't actually try to define it ourselves. We turn the question around and go ask people on the ground who did come back, to what degree is this your recovery? To what degree do you feel comfortable and satisfied with what happened? Rather than measuring this against just something like an economic recovery or a population recovery, which are easy to measure, but again, may be unlikely to capture what's actually happening. And we have this from all kinds of earthquakes, by the way, around the world, the Gujarat earthquake in India, the Kobe earthquake in Japan. Again, their population was not the same. The economics were not the same. And we didn't talk about this at all, by the way. We didn't talk about economics post-shock. Oftentimes, after a major shock, wages are depressed in the area for up to a decade, maybe longer in some cases, meaning that, again, we assume people just can go back and restart their jobs or whatever is going to be as it was. That is often not the case for a variety of structural challenges, right? So there may not be the same jobs that there were before. There may not be the same number of children in the schools. There may be a different level of population recovery. So for me, success for recovery has nothing to do with the number of people that have moved back or the money they're making, because again, wages are depressed and people may not be back in the same numbers. It's going to be about to what degree do people on the ground think this recovery reflected their desires, and how much degree they feel this is their recovery.
You must ask them.
You must ask them, exactly. Yeah, there's no other way to do it. You can't just do it from a census. You can't just do it from a 30,000-foot perspective looking down.
Thank you.
The question, Daniel, about the patterns of recovery. One of your slides showed the 3 lines of the recovery patterns, and one of them, the one in the middle, showed 2 different patterns. One that shows what we call usually a bouncing back, which is a permanent bouncing back, sometimes back to the previous or even better. And the other one showed kind of up and down, like amplitudes of bouncing up and down. Can you reflect a little bit about that? What are the difference between those 2 patterns?
Yeah, this is the mental health recovery that we've been doing after many disasters. And again, this is the Kessler-6 score. It's very easy to use. So actually, in some levels, we actually don't know why in some people's cases, there's this bounce and recover as was, a bounce and recover a little bit lower. Oftentimes, there are aspects of mental health that we simply don't understand. Sometimes some people are much more impacted by a major shock. For them, they do have symptoms of PTSD. They do have symptoms of inability to focus. Relationships suffer. We have higher divorce rates, alcoholism, other what we call risky behaviors go up, for example, prostitution and that kind of stuff. So we actually don't know in many cases what are the underlying psychological and mental factors that make that bounce more likely. The one factor we have seen consistently, as I mentioned, is bonding social capital. Individuals embedded in strong networks where they get support, they're more likely to have a strong recovery. But of course, as with any study that we've done with more than 15 people, there's huge variation. Just because people have a strong network does not mean that they're guaranteed a recovery or back to mental health as it was. And just because people don't have one doesn't mean they won't have a strong recovery. So this is a great question. And again, unfortunately, disasters are these tragedies that give us an experiment into what's going on. We don't fully understand yet all the conditions that translate into a better or worse mental health recovery. Again, bonding social networks are one important part of that, but certainly not the only factor.
Thank you. We are getting close to our end time. Any other questions from the audience? Michal, another question, or this is an old?
If I may, you were talking about links. You said there is one of the connections is linking from the people to the institutions or whatever. You mentioned one way is to have the people from the government going to the communities and talking to them. But are there other ways to connect, to advance this linking?
Yes. So it's building trust over time by being open and honest with a civilian population. And some of my colleagues in economics call this a series of micro transactions, which is a fancy way of saying it's never all at once that you can build trust. It's that you see in a series of interactions over time, we call this a repeated game, right? That over time, most of the time the government's being open and honest, and most of the time they have my best needs at well, so that we're sort of micro building this incremental trust. If in this process we see someone lying or dissembling or something else happens, there's corruption, right? Then we drop off that trust game, we lose that again, and we're back to very, very low. We have to build it up again if we can at all. So again, that's why being face-to-face with a decision maker, face-to-face with someone is so effective. It's, right now, you don't know if I'm, playing Tetris at the same time, or I'm trying to keep my kids quiet or whatever. You don't really know, right? But if we're face-to-face, if we have that interaction, it's much easier to read my face, to read my micro emotional state. It's much harder if the only interaction you have with the government is a radio announcement, a piece of paper in the mail, some 100-person meeting, right, where you're one of people in an audience. So that's why, again, I think we've seen success in those moments of embeddedness, where you have this connection that you can form. Again, otherwise it's just this abstract idea, and then again you're subject to disinformation, misinformation, network impact. So it's hard. I would say that's the bottom line. It is a very hard thing to build trust between people in the government. Again, especially if they feel that the government missed a chance to keep them safe, whether it's New Orleans or Fukushima or the 7th of October. Those are moments when, rightfully so, we think the government missed its job. And therefore, we suspect them of not really being able to protect us or help us during a moment of crisis.
And I'll add to that for Michal's question, and I'll say it in Hebrew, what we call it in Hebrew, כשיש חברים לא צריך פרוטקציה. Many of the Israelis have direct lines to different individuals in the government or in high levels, and they use it, and this time it seems like it's legitimate and valuable. I think we have reached our time, and let me just, well, first of all, thank you very, very much, Daniel. I think it was very valuable. You have gained, you have all the benefits of getting up early in the morning and getting our attention. As you've noticed, we have thrown on your shoulders heavy questions that we are all struggling with, hoping that you will answer all the questions and probably solve all our problems. No, we are not that naive, but we are quite desperate sometimes. I will appreciate if you can send us, indeed, as you mentioned, some of the materials that you have mentioned along your talk. You mentioned the K6 questionnaire. I think we have it, but I'll be happy to compare it with the one you have at hand or any other material that you have. As I mentioned at the beginning, this whole lecture and discussion is recorded, and we will distribute the...
רואים אותך כל הזמן, צוחק ומפטפט. אבל אז תעשה את התמונה, זה לא...
רחל, את בקול. We will distribute the presentation among all the members, and there is the email address of Daniel, so you are invited, I'll say it on the behalf of Professor Oldrich, to contact him straight or personally. I have also several questions that we raised at our resilience forum here, but I'll send it to you by mail and I'll ask your opinion about that. It would be a more useful way to discuss it. So once again, thank you very much. It seems like we will need your help for a long time from now. It doesn't seem to end very close, and maybe we will use this rain check that I mentioned to have you again, either by Zoom or physically, for another conversation and discussion in the near future. Thank you very much again.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Okay. Talk again soon. Thanks.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
היו כמה דברים טובים.